Aloha, it's Dr. Johnson, and today I want to talk a little bit about how you could use games with your elementary social studies classroom. Now, there are really two good reasons to use games. Number one, games are engaging. They're fun. Kids love them. Number two, games can help students remember information that you're teaching them. They're a very effective tool that way. Let's take a look at how this might work in your classroom. First of all, forget about what people think are traditional history games like Risk. Risk is a great way to learn geography, but it may not be the best way for an elementary classroom. Let's talk about how you can adapt some games out there and personalize them for your own classroom, like Apples to Apples. With Apples to Apples, you might be aware that it's a game where you're given a word, and I put the word out, the word is bogus, and then everyone else has to choose an example of that word they think that I will like. And I look at all the answers that the other players submit to me, and I say, I really think the most bogus thing up there is pro wrestling, and that's what I choose, and whoever put pro wrestling up there would get a point. Well, that's nice, except it's not about history, but we can adapt this game to history. I could say, hey, students, we've been learning about influential women as part of Women's History Month. So I'm interested in who you think the most influential woman was. You could have students write this on a Post-it note. You could have them research it and turn it in at the end of the week. And anyway, you let students submit who they think are the most influential ones. Think about what the students are having to do as they are submitting these. They have to think about why this person that they're submitting is influential, in this case, this woman. They have to analyze, they have to think about it, and it's a really effective learning tool. And then at the end, I as a teacher can talk about, oh wow, you suggested this. Now, you turned in Rosa Parks. Why do you think Rosa Parks was influential? And the students can explain their understanding. Really great little tool and can be turned into a game. It can also be turned into a really quick game. For instance, I could just use the word remarkable. I could say, who do you think the most remarkable woman was in history? And you can just say, hey, students, turn your answer in on a Post-it note. You give everyone a Post-it note. They write their answer down. They slap it on the board really quick. And then you can look at those, see what students are thinking. It could be used as an introductory activity. Maybe in third grade, I'm going to be talking about weather and the effects of weather on the environment. And I want to say, hey, what do you think the most devastating natural weather event happens? Natural disasters happen. What's the most devastating natural disaster? And once again, hand out Post-it notes. And then when students are putting them up there, you can start talking about it. Oh, I see tsunamis up here. I see earthquakes. I see tornadoes. I see fires. And it can help you introduce that topic. And then as a teacher, you can say, hey, I think for our area, since we live in Hawaii, close to the beach, I think the most devastating natural disaster is probably a tsunami or a flood of some sort. It could also be the end of a weekly unit, or maybe it's just a weekly topic. Like I had a middle school teacher who would put a word up on the board, and he'd say, this week we're going to be learning about, X, Y, and Z in class, and I want you to think, what was the most innovative thing? Maybe we're learning about inventions, and I'm thinking, we're going to learn about inventions this week, and when you think you have come up with the most innovative invention, the invention that you think is most innovative, put that invention up on the board. And then as you're learning about different inventions, students might slap up their silly putty or the wheel, or someone invented the internet. And then you could talk about that as a way to kind of solidify their understanding. So great way, Apples to Apples. Now another game you can adapt is Balderdash. Balderdash is a game where you are given a phrase or a word, and in the answers, one of these are true and the rest of the answers are made up. So the question that I have for you is, what does the name spam mean? And out of these 6 answers here, one of them is true. The other ones have been made up. So which one do you think is true about spam? And if you guessed B, C, or D, you were right. From the spam website, by the way, spam has often been known as spiced ham, but the actual name for spam, they're not quite sure where it came about. So there's some good evidence to show that maybe shoulder of pork and ham or sizzle pork and kind of interesting. So that is Balderdash. You could use Balderdash with history. For instance, here's President Andrew Jackson's inauguration. You might recognize Andrew Jackson from the $20 bill. I'll give you 3 stories. 1 is true, 2 are made up. Story number 1. President Andrew Jackson was the very first president to hold his inauguration at the White House. He decided that since it was the people's house, that the inauguration should happen there. So instead of having it at the Capitol or at other locations that other presidents had held, he decided he would have his inauguration, and his inauguration speech would be given at the White House. That's story number 1. Story number 2. President Jackson loved people. He was a populist president, is what we call them. And so he threw a gigantic party at the White House. He invited everyone that he could. And they had food and they had drink. And by drink, I mean they had alcohol. And it became such a raucous party. And there were so many people in the White House that Andrew Jackson was almost crushed by the crowd. And in fact, one of Andrew Jackson's aides had to push him out a window to escape being crushed by the crowd. And he had to leave the White House, escape the White House, because it was such a large, rowdy party. That was story number 2. Story number 3. Andrew Jackson was sworn in at the Capitol building, which is traditional. But his opponent that he ran against, the incumbent president at the time, did not and was not happy that he was elected. And so he took his time moving out of the White House. So by the time Andrew Jackson came from the Capitol building to move into the White House later that day, Inauguration Day, all of the former president's belongings were still in the White House. And Andrew Jackson supporters were so enraged that they went into the White House and started pulling out all of the old president's furniture and personal goods, his clothing, throwing them out the windows onto the front lawn. And it was not a very amenable transition of power. So one of those stories is true, 2 of them are false. You can see how Balderdash works, and then you could talk about that. So the actual story was he threw such a raucous party that he was almost crushed to death and had to be taken out through a side window in order not to be crushed to death. Crazy, crazy story. So Balderdash, you could adapt that in a lot of different ways, have different teams take on different stories. I have a whole collection of presidential inauguration stories with primary source documents on the front and with the story on the back, and you can let students make up their own stories to that. So that's a fun one. Balderdash can be used for a lot of historical events as well as other things. All right. Oh, yeah. We're not going to get into Woodrow Wilson, but here's another example of Balderdash, who was Otto Funk. Really simple Balderdash. Now, Balderdash is really easy to play, especially if you have any of the new online tools. You could put this in an online system and students could respond on the computer. But just interesting facts here. It was Otto Funk. It's a great way to introduce a topic. Otto Funk broke the world record by playing the violin while walking across the country from New York to San Francisco. And then I could follow this up with a lot of primary source information about Otto Funk that might lead us into a really fun study of history. All right, Balderdash, fun game. All right, here's the classic history game. Oregon Trail. If you've never played Oregon Trail, you can go to this Google slideshow and you can actually click on Oregon Trail. It'll open up the old version, and they do have a new version. But in the Oregon Trail, they actually, it's quite a complex game where you make decisions as if you were a traveler on the Oregon Trail and you try to get to Oregon safely. If you have not played Oregon Trail, please go online and try it out. You can play right on the internet now. And it was the modern forerunner of an educational game in a computer program. It was developed by a company called the Minnesota Educational Computer Consortium and is by far the most popular game that they made. And by the way, this company, MEC, was not a for-profit company. They sold the games to schools basically at cost, so it was very inexpensive and easy to get, and they never really pursued anyone who were making illegal copies of the games because their whole objective was for students to learn. So Oregon Trail has been remade. But there's been a lot of new online games show up, which are very, very complex and very, very engaging. This one is called Mission US. You could Google it. They actually have a fifth one. I just have the 4 up here. But they have these scenarios of different parts of U.S. history. And you play as if you are a person. For instance, Mission 4, City of Immigrants. It's 1907. You are Lena Brodsky, a Jewish 14-year-old from Russia. How will you start a new life in America? And the game is complex that you can play as a whole class. They actually have lesson plans for you to follow and use as you play as a class. The game itself would take you several hours if you played straight through, would take you several weeks if you played as a class. So it could be a great learning tool in the classroom. You learn all about different parts of U.S. history as a game. And even if you're not into that, of course, we've looked at iCivics games for civics and political science, and those are great games to use. And you can even go to PBS. They have all sorts of social studies games. A lot of them are geography based, of course, but a lot of really useful, fun things out there for students to play to help them with history. Now, this is one of my favorite history games. This is called Timeline. It's an actual card game that you buy. I have all different versions of this. What happens is you have the front of these cards, which have just, this is inventions. So these are 4 different inventions: the safe, the milk carton, the cork, and black powder. And you try to put them in order about when they were invented. And if you put them in the correct order, you get points. If you don't put them in the correct order, you don't get points. That's a fun game. Here's another one. This is history. Timeline history, so all the cards are historical events, and once again you're trying to put them in order from the front of the cards, and then you flip the card over, and on the back of the card is a date. And they have these timelines for all sorts of different things: U.S. historical events, world history, inventions, science, and discoveries. Kind of a fun little game to play. But as I was thinking about this, I thought, well, what if you're not a 5th grade teacher, you're not teaching U.S. history, then Timeline isn't that great. Well, Timeline could be customized. Maybe you're a 3rd grade or a 4th grade teacher, or even a 2nd grade teacher learning about famous Hawaiians. And you might make your own timeline cards. This is really easy to do. It took me 5 minutes to take photos, paste them in. I could print these off on a computer and cut them out, print them on paper. I could have students make their own, give them 3x5 cards, and then they could make their own famous person. And on one side of the card, you would have the person's name, and in the back of the card, you would have the day they were born. And I could say, put these 5 people in order from the one who was born earliest to the one who was born most recently. And along the way, we'd be able to talk about these famous people. Or maybe I give these cards out to students, kind of like trading cards, as we're learning about famous Hawaiians. Like maybe we're going to spend a day learning about Duke Kahanamoku. And on that day we do that, I've printed maybe a card out for every student. I could say, here's a new card to add to your Hawaii card collection. And then they could play this game on their own. And then on the back of the card, you could put the date of when each one of these people were born, and kind of a fun little learning game. So anyway, lots of games that are out there. Once again, remember, games are just so advantageous, and I've only touched on a few that you might use. But remember, number 1, they are engaging. Students love to play games. So if you can find ways of making it a game, that will be to your advantage as a teacher. Number 2, games help students retain information. And you can set up games to really help reinforce concepts you're teaching and remember information, especially historical information, which sometimes can be very difficult or challenging for students to learn. So I hope this helps you out, and have a great day in your teaching. Play some fun games and enjoy all that you do. Thanks so much.